The United States Supreme Court makes a major decision on race and college admissions. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Last week, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that race-conscious admissions at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina were unlawful. The controversial decision effectively ends decades-old policies of affirmative action programs at colleges and universities across the United States. The policies were designed to counter generations of racial discrimination in America and to create diverse student bodies. Edward Bloom, who has waged a years-long campaign against affirmative action, had this reaction to the court's ruling.
These opinions reestablish the founding principles of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which clearly forbids treating Americans differently by race. These obligations compel the removal of all racial and ethnic classification boxes from undergraduate and postgraduate application forms.
Now, President Joe Biden has also been talking about this. He weighed in and he was critical of the court's decision.
The court has effectively ended affirmative action in college admissions, and I strongly disagree with the court's decision. I've always believed that the promise of America is big enough for everyone to succeed, and that every generation of Americans, we have benefited by opening the doors of opportunity just a little bit wider to include those who've been left behind. I believe our colleges are stronger when they're racially diverse.
Okay, let's hear from our panel. Joining us from Boston is Swan Lee. She is co-founder of the Asian American Coalition for Education. Here in Washington, D.C., we are also joined by Nyambi Carter. She is Associate Professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Also with us is Adolfo Franco. He is an attorney and Republican strategist. And joining the discussion too is Douglas Sloan. He is Principal and Senior Political Analyst at National Capital Strategy Group. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Swan Lee, let me start with you. That Supreme Court decision has been welcomed by some in the Asian American community. Your organization, for one, the Asian American Coalition for Education, has welcomed it. What do you hope this decision will achieve when it comes to college and university admissions?
Well, on one hand, we are very happy because this affirms Asian Americans' constitutional right of equal protection. Because race is an immutable factor, none of us has any personal choice in it. We didn't choose to be born the race we are. We believe people should be evaluated on the results of their personal choices and their personal efforts, not on their race. We cannot choose it. So we're hoping Asian American students will be judged by their academic merit, extracurricular activities, essays, but not their race, because, as I said, they have no choice in it.
Well, you do make the point that race is something that one cannot change, but isn't there an argument also that this affirmative action helps people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds? It tries to correct an imbalance.
Disadvantaged background, that is a socioeconomic status factor. Actually, that is one of the proposed solution SFFA proposed to Harvard during the course of the lawsuit, is to consider socioeconomic status instead of race, because considering race creates racial stereotypes to African American, Asian American, to everybody. It creates racial bigotry. But socioeconomic status doesn't have this bad effect. But Harvard said no. So they don't want to consider socioeconomic status. We do not oppose consider socioeconomic status to help qualified low-income disadvantaged students.
Nyambi Carter, many in the African American community are outraged by this decision by the United States Supreme Court. I mean, how important has affirmative action been for the African American community? And what are your fears now that this decision has been handed down?
Well, first, thank you, Anand, for having me. I think affirmative action has gotten kind of a bad rap. in part because people think that affirmative action creates racial stereotypes. Affirmative action doesn't create racial stereotypes. The way that we attach value to racial categories existed long before we had anything called affirmative action. The other thing is assumptions about Black inferiority or ill preparedness or just sort of less deservingness often go without a second mention in this conversation. No one here has had anything about the idea that it could possibly be that Black students should be in those same institutions, in same spaces. Everyone keeps coming back to test scores and merit and all of these things. These are nice watchwords, but no one has that same energy for legacy admits, for athletics, for people whose parents gave very nice donations to come to those schools. But there's always the sort of the Black or brown student that is blamed for taking seats away, that they are less deserving and shouldn't be in that space, and not really thinking about what affirmative action was actually called to do, which is try to make equal institutions that have never been equal, institutions that have remained closed, really to many minority communities, not just Black people, Native Americans, women, and other people who are minoritized in this country. And so they don't deal with that part, but say that it's the policy that is meant to address these things and try to alleviate these discriminations as the reason for the discrimination. And I think that's wholly dishonest. I think that there are real disagreements that one can have with affirmative action, but to suggest that affirmative action is the cause of bigotry, racism, exclusion, and et cetera, I think is disingenuous and does sort of ignore how important this policy has been to creating something that looks like a middle class for some minority communities that may not have been present without this policy in the first place.
Adolfo Franco, one of the dissenting judges on the U.S. Supreme Court in this particular decision, Sonia Sotomayor, she's a very outspoken justice, she said in her dissent that affirmative action was crucial to counter persistent and systematic racial discrimination in education, and she warned that this decision just entrenches, quote, racial inequality in education. How do you see it?
Well, I don't believe the country is systemically racist, and she does. There's the big divide in the country over that. I think she's dead wrong. I think Chief Justice Roberts absolutely got it right. The way to end, these are his words, the way to end racial discrimination is to end racial discrimination and discriminating among groups to try to achieve quotas. But I have to correct the program here and your research team. Affirmative action was reversed by the Supreme Court in 1977 in the Bakke, California Regents versus Bakke case. Affirmative action was absolutely thrown out by the court at that time. What happened at that time was a nuanced decision, really words by then Justice Lewis Powell that allowed consideration of what was then used the term personality, and that has been manipulated over a number of years, and this has been challenged, has been chipped away by the courts for universities like Harvard and North Carolina to manipulate the system to, in essence, have affirmative action to the back door. This slammed the brakes in part. We won't really get there until those little boxes you check that say you're Black, you're Hispanic, you're Asian. When those are eliminated, and the analysis is based blindly on merit and your background, social economic background, but then the merit, the scores of the individuals applying are what should control. As an example here, if you really examine the case closely, 95% of the Asians who were denied admission rated higher and had another compelling stories. Had that box not been checked, they would have been admitted, but instead, other minority groups were accommodated and their merit was reduced. Now, this is in clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the United States. And for those of you who are fans of Martin Luther King, he was never talking about affirmative actions. He was talking about being judged by the character of their content, people being allowed into the system, which, of course, this is the America of 2023. As much as the left tries to make this the America of the 1950s, it is not. Merit should be the controlling factor, and that is what this court has rightly decided based on the Bakke decision, which clearly outlawed affirmative action. Lastly, this is not a right or left issue. All polls indicate the vast majority of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, are against affirmative action. Indeed, California twice through propositions voted to end affirmative action. It was the legislature that overrode the people of California by putting it into the statute. So much for democracy, by the way. But that is exactly where the American people stand, and that's the correct decision. Legally, from a political standpoint, and the right policy. People should be let into schools based on merit. And by the way, had legacy been before the court decides the narrow decisions. The court is not a policy body. It just decides narrowly what's before it. I completely agree with the other guest that legacy is also unconstitutional.
Okay, Douglas, what do you make of Adolfo's argument there that merit should be the controlling factor?
Well, I think that we are not taking into account the importance of diversity in some of these classrooms and having diverse voices and different viewpoints, and how important that is to one's education and development in this country. Obviously, merit should play a very important role, but it's also difficult to erase decades of systemic oppression and institutionalized racism in this country that has tilted the playing field in one direction as opposed to the other. We have to take all of this into consideration, and we really need to be careful in terms of, it seems that the Supreme Court has made a blanket assessment saying that racism no longer exists in America, when we all know that's not true. But if you're going to say that, oh, it's only going to be merit-based, surely you must take into account that blacks and Hispanics in particular have suffered from decades of discrimination and racism that has tilted the playing field towards white people and perhaps some Asians, and that you should have something in place there to try to make up for those decades of racism and discrimination. And that's what affirmative action was originally for. Adolfo said taking away the boxes. Well, the boxes haven't been taken away. Adolfo said they should talk about legacy admissions. They're not talking about legacy admissions. All they're talking about is affirmative action, and that will have a disproportionate effect on black and Hispanic students.
Okay, Douglas,
which I would think is something we're trying to.
I don't know if there's another lawyer on your program, but the Supreme Court or any court only decides what's before it. The Supreme Court cannot touch the legacy issue. Someone should bring that lawsuit.
Right.
If someone brings that lawsuit, then that will be decided. The Supreme Court is not a policy-making body. It is not Congress. You have to understand that. It decided what was before it, which were Asian students bringing this action. But it also had legacy students brought this, I think the same result would have happened.
Okay, Nyambi, you want to say something? Go ahead.
But the Supreme Court decides its own docket. So the Supreme Court is very clear about what cases it wants to hear and where it does want to actually set policy. No, they don't set policy in the same way Congress does, but we know that Supreme Court decisions actually do go a long way to setting the tone. We saw it right after the Dobbs decision. This will be no different. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say they don't make policy and they don't do anything but decide what's before it. They decide what comes before them. They could have turned this case away, and they didn't. So they do have some skin in this game, if you will.
Okay.
Was there a legacy lawsuit they turned down?
I'm not disputing that with you. I'm just saying that the Supreme Court gets to choose its docket. So yes, it decides what comes before it, but it also gets to choose what comes before it.
Correct.
So I want to get back to Douglas. Douglas, I wonder if you could just clarify one point for us, and that this decision did not discount race completely in admissions, because as far as I understand it, the court has ruled that race will still be a factor. Prospective students to universities and colleges will be able to discuss their experiences in the college essays that they hand in. How would that impact admissions?
That's true. The colleges and universities can still choose if they want to arbitrarily do so, use race as a factor, and there's not anything technically stopping them from doing that. However, this takes away the mandate that says, hey, we need to try as a body, as a country, to even the playing field regarding some of the years of institutionalized racism and systemic oppression that blacks and Hispanics have faced.
Yeah.
That's the main issue that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But colleges, you're right, colleges can choose to still adhere to an effort to ensure that their student bodies are diverse.
Okay, Swan Lee, the attorneys acting for Students for Fair Admissions, which was the organization that sued Harvard University as well as the University of North Carolina, claimed that schools have turned away, getting back to a point that was mentioned earlier on, turned away large numbers of Asian Americans with excellent grades and scores. So what happens now? Is that going to change?
It should, because based on the inside admission data from Harvard, when applicants have similar qualifications, they have drastically different acceptance rate based on their race. If an applicant identifies as African American, then he has almost 90% rate of getting in. But if he identifies as Asian American, has a 25% rate of getting in. This is a travesty. We were glad the Supreme Court has corrected it, has defended Asian American students' basic constitutional right of equal protection. This is an unalienable right. Nobody can take it away from us. It doesn't matter if it benefits them. Benefits them is not an excuse to take away other people's constitutional rights. So we are glad this has been corrected. And SFFA also proposed, and we support getting rid of the legacy admissions. We actually proposed that during the core of the lawsuit, and Harvard said no. So we absolutely support getting rid of legacy admissions and consider socioeconomic status factor to help disadvantaged students. And also very important is merit, because merit is the purpose of education to prepare students for future success in the global economy. Because they will not only compete with cohorts from America, they will compete with talents from all over the world. If we fudge up education, we will fail our students. They won't be able to succeed. They will underachieve in the global economy. So it's important we restore meritocracy to education. And that is for all of America. And that is why, based on the Pew Research Center surveys and the Gallup surveys, about 80% of Americans support getting rid of racial factor. We want quality education. That is the grassroots stance. It's the majority stance.
Okay. You know, may I quickly, because that is so well and articulately stated. Let me say what the court has said. The court has said merit, just as the guest has just described here, merit is controlling. However, if you have two equally qualified with merit applications, then other factors can be considered. So absolutely, and it is not limited to blacks and Latinos. It could be a white person from Appalachia or an Asian from some that suffered a great deal and to struggle. So it said if you have the merit, but you cannot have a case because of just simply having, in essence, quotas in the name of quote unquote diversity, because then you're discriminating against other people and other groups. And now you want to play this race card nonsense and systemic racism, which is still being played. That worked 50 or 60 years ago. That's not the America of today. And since we're personalizing things, my background is Latino. My father arrived from Cuba in 1961 without speaking English, age 40, no English, no money. 15 years later, he graduated with a PhD from the University of Iowa without affirmative action, without any quotas, and without any preferential treatment. He did it on merit, and that's what the guest is saying. Now, had someone else suffered more and had his equal qualifications, that person should have taken my father's slot. But my father should not have taken the slot of somebody who's more qualified.
Okay.
Yes, may I add, Harvard's admission rate is only 4%. That means the competition is not only between applicants of different races, it is actually between applicants of the same racial group too. So of the African-American applicants, about 96% of them will not be admitted, but 4% will be admitted by Harvard. So using race actually helps upper-class students more than the lower-class students. Because based on the inside data from Harvard admissions, about 70% of the African-American students who benefited from affirmative action are from upper-class, richer background. And that is a travesty because we know the majority of the country population is not.
Okay, I want to get
it helps
Nyambi's.
upper class
Okay,
students.
I need to get Nyambi Carter's responses to those numbers that you mentioned. And Nyambi, you know, we've heard about the Constitution and the equal rights clauses in the Constitution, but if we also look at some real world cases, I mean, if you look at Justice Sotomayor, who sits on the Supreme Court right now, she is of Latin origin, and she has said that she's benefited from affirmative action, as have many others of Latin origin. One could say the same of Clarence Thomas, who sits on the Supreme Court as well. I mean, does this ruling now end all that?
Does it end all of what?
The fact that these people enjoyed those affirmative action rights.
Oh, no. I mean, they still do. I mean, they have benefits of Ivy League educations. I think the thing about affirmative action that people don't want to admit is that when you've had everything most of the time, any time that somebody chips away at that, it feels like someone is taking something from you. I mean, when we talk about merit being restored, when was it ever meritorious to begin with? And I think when we look at institutions, whether we're talking about educational institutions or we're talking about in rates of home ownership, all of these other things, the truth of the matter is there are still a number of people that have remained a stable underclass. And I agree with Swan. I mean, when we looked at Harvard's admission data, it did tend to benefit students who were children of immigrants and people who might have been of higher incomes. But that still doesn't negate the fact that there are most people, right, that would consider themselves racial minorities in this country are not doing as well as those numbers might suggest. I mean, when we look in the aggregate, not at individual cases, but in the aggregate, right, when we look at somebody like me, a Black woman, I would still make $20,000 less than a white man, all things being equal. That doesn't just happen. That's not just because I'm not as smart or I'm not as driven or I don't work as hard. And I think when we talk about things like affirmative action, we get very lax with the language. And it's easy to say, well, it's just about test scores and it's just about grades. But we know grade inflation is real. We know through multiple sites, through multiple data points, that all that the SAT really measures is your ability to take a test, and it really does comport with your parents' socioeconomic status. Not all the time, let me be clear, not all the time, but most of that tells us these scores aren't really telling you about anything that has to do with college. They're telling you about people's ability to take tests. It doesn't tell you about people's tenacity. It doesn't tell you about things that make people interesting and all of these other things. So I think, yes, we could do better than just do race, but race is a shorthand for lots of things. And to pretend that race doesn't matter, that if we just ban the box, if you will, on race, that racial discrimination will go away, it doesn't. It won't. It never has. And I think by not keeping up with that metric or keeping up with those metrics, there are lots of places where we might actually see discrimination against, say, these even very same Asian students, if we don't keep that information and use it for positive outcomes.
Okay, Douglas, you know, as I said at the beginning of the show, President Biden has been talking about this, and he said despite the ruling, discrimination is still very prevalent in the United States. Let's listen to that.
We all know it. Discrimination still exists in America. Discrimination still exists in America. Discrimination still exists in America. Today's decision does not change that.
So, Douglas, is there a risk here that what we have seen in the Supreme Court could extend to other areas like employment and in the business, corporate world?
Please. I think it could. I think that there's definitely a possibility. I think that now that we have this precedent set by the Supreme Court, that people could start to try to use this as rationale for, trying to ensure that there's not any racial diversity within the workplace or in other situations throughout the country. And it's really an insane argument to say that, racism doesn't exist, or my friend Adolfo said that this isn't America of 50 years ago in the 70s. Well, we see the racism every day. We see the white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia. We see neo-Nazi. We see racism rear its ugly head. Now more than ever, I'd say in the last 5 or 7 years, we've seen a lot of racism. We've seen a resurgence of racism in this country. So I would say that we're seeing more aggressive, virulent racism now than we would have seen 15 or 20 years ago. So of course, now that it's out and about, we're going to see it in the classrooms. Obviously, we're going to see it in the workplace. Obviously, we're going to see it in other places. And it was these programs that were set in place, like just before the Roberts Court gutted the Voting Rights Amendment. The southern states needed permission before they changed their rules.
I have to add. Douglas is my good friend, as you know.
But let's get a quick response from Adolfo. I'm running out of time. Adolfo, a quick response from you.
A couple things. Racism isn't a one-way street. I think Mr. Farrakhan is an awful racist. I think Al Sharpton is a racist. So racism and discrimination, we're going to have to live with that situation. You're not going to legislate it away. But no, let me finish. I'll let you finish. Racism is a problem too. Let me say this to this program, to be clear. Affirmative action was rejected and overturned by the Supreme Court in 1977. This is not a new decision. This builds on that decision, and there should have been a legal analysis program. This still has factors for personal reasons and experience.
All right.
It reaffirms the Bakke case that overturned affirmative action, despite the fact that the majority of them.
All right, I need to get to Swan Lee very quickly. I've only got 40 seconds, Swan Lee, but not all Asians are supporting this ruling. In fact, some Asian American civil rights groups filed what are known as Friends of the Court briefs defending race-conscious admissions policies. I mean, some say this could hurt less well-off students. Is that a concern?
I think this is a difference between educational philosophies. We represent the side that focuses on merit and helps students by giving them good education so they can do well in the global economy, versus the other side who pays more attention to these immutable factors and putting together a class that they see that looks good, looks diverse. But actually in California and Washington state, which are one of the most progressive states, affirmative action has already been stopped, have already been outlawed years ago. And they were brought back recently on the bills for the voters to vote on, and they both failed.
Okay, we have to leave it there. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us on the show. That's the Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.